Hey Beaks, it's Mr. Boylan, and today I want to wrap up our conversation on population genetics by going back into natural selection, right? Natural selection, you already know what that means. It means when there's variation, heritable variation in a population, and whoever has those beneficial alleles for whatever environment you find yourself in is more likely to survive and reproduce, right? But selection goes a little bit deeper than that, so let's take a look here. Okay, so natural selection is the only mechanism that consistently causes adaptive evolution. So evolution by natural selection involves both chance and sorting. So what does that mean? Chance is really just the mutations, right? We have no control over that, and they can lead to variation. So mutations are the chance, but the sorting is really because the beneficial alleles are sorted, and nature selects those with the best alleles. And that's again why only natural selection causes adaptive evolution. Right? We talked about genetic drift and gene flow. You're not necessarily getting better adapted to your environment because of those, but natural selection, well, sure you are. Okay, so how does natural selection work? Well, it brings about adaptive change by acting on an organism's phenotype, right? So the genetic component you know is already in here in this amazing looking caterpillar, and now the phenotype is a resultant through gene expression, and that's what natural selection acts on, right? The phenotype, which is related to the genotype, of course. So the phrases struggle for existence, survival of the fittest, they're pretty misleading. As biology teachers, we try to stay away from those simply because it's better to say reproductive success because it's more subtle and kids will understand and students will understand there's a lot more that can go into those phrases, right? When you hear the terms relative fitness, again, it's a contribution of an individual to the gene pool of the next generation, right? And it's in relation to the contributions of others. So if you happen to have or leave behind more offspring than somebody else, well, then you have a higher relative fitness, right? And generally, those with the highest relative fitness means that they have the better alleles, right? So selection favors certain genotypes, again, by acting on the phenotypes of these organisms. So there are three modes of selection. We have directional selection, which favors individuals at one side of a phenotypic range, which we're going to show as curves. And you have disruptive selection, which again favors individuals at both extremes of the phenotypic range or curves. And stabilizing selection is going to favor intermediate variants, okay, and acts against extreme phenotypes. So let's take a look at these three types of selection. Okay, so here you can see some coat color in mice. And what you're seeing here is in this fur, you either have a very light colored fur, very dark, or somewhere in between. Now, if it was directional selection, that would say that, well, in this population, in this case, the dotted line is the newer population, that these mice over here with the darker colors must have been more fit for whatever environment they were in. Right? And as you can see, the next population, the curve shifted. Okay. Now, if you're talking about disruptive selection, what that means is that either of the extremes of that phenotypic range were actually better. So in this case, you could see that the light and the dark colored mice were better than these intermediate colors, right? And the next generation dipped there. And this can actually lead to speciation if this continues. And eventually stabilizing selection, that's when it's neither extreme but in the middle, the average that's actually best suited for that population and the next generation. You see how that can go up. So we'll take a look at some examples of each of these. Okay, so these came from an old textbook I used to use on population genetics, but bear with me, I believe that they're scientifically valid. So, of course, with Darwin's finches, we already talked about this before. Now, it did change the graph. In this case, the original population is the dotted line, and the new population is solid. But regardless, if a bird would do better in a population for whatever reason by having a larger beak, okay, well, then that's directional selection. Right? Look at the beak size of birds in the original population, and the small beak birds, for whatever, probably because the food source, they weren't as able to get food with their smaller beaks. So in the next generation, these guys down here didn't mate as often, right? Whereas these guys over in this area mated much more, and now look at the average beak size, okay, in the next generation. So that's directional selection. One side of the original curve over here was more fit for that environment than the other side, so it moves in one direction, okay? Another example here is frogs with tongues. The longer tongues will be more fit. Sure. So if you think about it, let's look at tongue length. And if a frog can reach that tongue out very far and grab a cricket, okay, well, yeah, that would be better, right? And the frogs would rather have longer tongues so they can catch more prey. However, of course, you're going to reach a point then when, well, you can't keep getting longer and longer and longer. It would take a lot of energy to carry around that huge tongue all day. So, and then you eventually stabilize. Okay, but again, that's directional because it moved in one direction. Disruptive is a little different. Okay, so in this case, let's go back to Darwin's finches for a second. And these are just images I took from Google, so I don't exactly know what species these are, but I just want to get to see different beak sizes. And basically, sure, you could have a small beak size, a medium beak size, and a large beak size. Now, if this is disruptive selection, let's talk about food again. Maybe birds with small beaks can fit this little beak inside of little cracks and trees and things like that, or get under little heavy rocks or something. They can get some insects or seeds or things like that. And birds with really big beaks, well, maybe they can crack open seeds or snails or something like that, so they're big and strong. The problem is these birds right here aren't really good at getting into those little cracks, and they're not really big enough to crack a whole lot of seeds, so they're the worst in this population. Okay, and what's going to happen is you're going to dip. Right now, the outside, okay, is more fit for that population, the extremes of the phenotypic range. So what's going to happen is you dip in the middle. Okay, and like I said, this could actually lead, and does lead, to speciation, where eventually mating might stop between these populations here. And the definition of species is you can and will produce fertile offspring. If you decide to stop mating, well, new species can show up. Then we go to stabilizing selection. Okay, and here we can look at human babies are a good example of this. So babies come in all shapes and sizes, all right, and as you can see here, the birth mass, right? Now, some babies are born, okay, and I don't know where this graph came from, if we're talking about premature babies and things like that. I don't believe so. I believe this is, let's just say, the normal delivery of a healthy baby here. So if you have a very small baby or a very, very large baby, that's actually not as good, right, for the life expectancy of that child. What we want is a very normal-sized baby, somewhere in here, okay? And again, with healthcare in the world today, we're doing pretty well no matter what. But for the most part, you would rather have this. So over generations, look what's been happening. The birth mass is getting stabilized, right? So that's stabilizing selection, when the extremes of the phenotypic range are selected against, and it's better to be average in stabilizing. Okay, that's just so cool. But if we look here again, let's go back to the frog. And again, bear with me. I really like this book, which is why I'm using it, but I don't know, I haven't heard this before, but frogs can have very fin-like legs, okay, which are webbed and help them swim, or they can have very leg-like, like muscular legs that helps them jump. And as you know, these amphibians live in the water and on land, so they have to be good at both, okay? And what's going to happen here is, well, if you just have, let's say, fin-like legs, and you're the world's best swimming frog, well, that's great, but what about when you're out of the water? Right, when you're out of the water, you might need those leg-like legs to jump away from a predator. Okay, well then what if you're over here and now you have these leg-like legs, these muscular legs, and you could jump like crazy, but maybe they're not as streamlined for swimming. Okay, so now when you're on land, you're pretty good, but when you're in the water, maybe not so good. So stabilizing selection says, yeah, you want kind of both, right? You don't want to have just swim-like legs or just jump-like legs. You want to have a nice mix, okay, in your legs of those two traits. All right, so that's an example of, we had directional, okay, we had disruptive, and now stabilizing selection. Okay, so now let's move ahead to the key role of natural selection in adaptive evolution. So striking adaptations have arisen by natural selection. This is why all of us love animals so much, right? There's so many different types of animals with all their different adaptations for all the different environments on the planet, right? For example, this cuttlefish. So many people love this cuttlefish, and it's amazing how it can change colors and kind of hypnotize things. Really, really cool fish, and lots of adaptations involved there. Here you can see the jaws of a snake, right? The snakes have these bones inside that are kind of mobile, and that allows them to open their jaws super wide and eat things that you would never think that they could eat, right? And here you can see a Burmese python that bit off more than he can chew, right? So here's the snake, and he tried to eat an alligator, and it didn't go so well. I guess it ripped through, so oh well. So here's a famous example, right, of an adaptation. It increases the frequencies of alleles against that enhance survival and reproduction, okay? And this can change as the environment changes. So this is the peppered moth, and as you can see here, there's actually two moths in this green picture here on top of all these lichens on this tree. Here we can see the carbonaria form, and here we can see the the speckled form, okay? And what happened was during the Industrial Revolution, I'm sure you've learned about this before, in England, the soot from the factories started turning all the trees in the forests around the cities black, and all of a sudden the allelic frequencies changed. This used to be the more common guy, right? Because his phenotype allowed him to camouflage himself better, and thus he lived longer and had more kids. But all of a sudden, after the Industrial Revolution really got going, well, now this guy, as the trees turned black, he started blending in more, and this guy started showing himself more to predators, and thus the allelic frequencies changed, and the darker variant became more common in a population. Eventually, thank goodness, the government got on these factories and said, hey, we're destroying the environment, let's get scrubbers on these factories and things like that, on the smokestacks, let's make it better. And as the trees returned to normal, guess what? The allelic frequency again changed because the environment was changing, and he became more common in the population again. Because the environment can change, adaptive evolution is continuous, in other words, right? So I grew up, can you believe this? This was me when I was younger, right? Look at what you guys have today with your Switch. You can walk around with it. That's just insane. But evolution, obviously, is a dynamic process, and it's a continuous process. Okay, so genetic drift and gene flow, so we talked about these before. These don't consistently lead to adaptive evolution, and you know why, right? Because they could increase the fitness or increase the match between an organism and its environment, but it could also just as easily decrease that match, right? These are random. This is just random changes, whether you're talking about just random changes in allelic frequency because, oops, somebody wearing nice shoes walking through the forest destroyed some of the green beetles in his population, thus the population left over is now, you know, less green. Well, that was just chance. Or maybe you could have gene flow, whereas you had a population of green or brown beetles, and hey, 2 green beetles went to the brown population. Right? That's nothing to do with the environment. It's just random chance or immigration, emigration, in that case, in gene flow. Okay, we also have sexual selection, and this is pretty cool. I remember being in college and we learned in this animal behavior class all about sexual selection and different things. Really, really cool stuff. So it's natural selection for mating success, right? And it results, or can result, in sexual dimorphism, which are when you see differences between sexes, right? So here you can see 2 cardinals, which we have all around us, right? These are all over the place. You can see the female and the male. And we'll get into this in a second, why this male is probably so red, because maybe this female actually mates more often with the reddest, loudest male, even though he might be subjecting himself to predators. And here you can see the peacock feathers. Look at him displaying that plumage right there. It's just absolutely unbelievable. I mean, I'm attracted to it. It's beautiful. So you have intrasexual selection, and that's competition among individuals of one sex, right? Intra means within. So within a sex, you have this selection going on, and this is when one sex, usually males, fight for the female. Okay, so this is you know, part of why the Bachelor is so amazing. There's a shout out for the Bachelor. So if you don't watch the Bachelor, you might want to consider that to understand population genetics a little bit more. But yeah, so these bucks right here, they're fighting for a female. That's intrasexual selection. Whereas you can also have intersexual selection, right? Between sexes, you can have selection going on. And this is often called mate choice, right? And it occurs when individuals of one sex, usually the females, get to be the choosy ones, and the males have to be so showy, right? Like, I don't know, if you're a female, how could you turn this guy down? Look at him with his devil eyes and that beautiful blood red nose. I mean, he's very showy, right? And a female might look at him and say, wow, you really are attractive. And that might increase my offspring's chances of living long lives and being attractive themselves and finding mates. And those genes will keep getting propagated through generations. So how do female preferences evolve? That's really being studied a lot still by evolutionary biologists, but we certainly seem to subscribe to the good genes hypothesis, right? So that if a trait is related to male health, both the male trait and a female preference for that trait should increase in frequency, right? If you've never seen these, you should definitely watch some YouTube videos on the birds of paradise. They have these amazing dances. This is actually a bird, right? And his beak and head is right in this area. These are all of his feathers kind of inverted forward as he jumps around a log and does a dance. And she's just checking him out, thinking, we'll see if I deem you worthy to mate. So the good genes hypothesis says, all right, if your genes are good enough, okay, that if it's related to your health, then I'm going to like them more, okay? Kind of like maybe that cardinal that was very red before. Sure, maybe the more red the cardinal, the more able you are to survive, because obviously predators can see you more, right? The brighter you are, so maybe that's a good thing. Here's an experiment they did on frogs, okay, these little tree frogs, and they found out that, okay, frogs can have either a short call or they can have a long call, okay, when they're making their noises there. And the female gray tree frog lays the eggs, and then the male's sperm, okay, will fertilize the eggs. So it's not very choosy, okay, in this case, but what happens is, let's take a look down here, the larval survivor, or the survival, excuse me, the long call had better, okay, survivor rates than the short call. And then in 96, there was no significant difference. Larval growth, okay, so the survival, it seemed to show was better, at least in the 95 study. The growth, okay, of the little tadpoles, it was actually better. Again, this showed in 1996 for the long call. And then the time to metamorphosis, which again, you're at a very, this is a very scary time to be a frog when you're a tadpole, right? Because anything can get you. And it's better to have sperm from a long call because it's shorter in both of those cases, your time to metamorphosis to become an actual frog. So again, the good genes hypothesis says that, yeah, you would think that you would rather mate with somebody with a long call, or long calls will get passed on more eventually to generations. Yeah, that makes perfect sense, right? Okay. Preservation of genetic variation. Okay, so how do we make sure that we keep this variation in a population? Now, you already know about meiosis and the different things with sexual reproduction that happens. But, and of course, there's mutations. But how do we maintain or preserve this genetic variation in other ways? Well, neutral variation is genetic variation that does not confer a selective advantage or disadvantage, right? So in neutral variation, it just means that, yeah, we're going to keep variation in a population somehow, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's a good or a bad thing. And an easy way to do that is diploidy, right? We already know about diploidy. So you have two, right, genes, or two copies of each gene, one from each parent. And diploidy means that, oh yeah, let's think if there's a recessive gene out there, you don't even have to have it because you won't display it, right, if you're a heterozygote, but it's still there. And then you know that that means heterozygotes can carry it and then give it to their kids someday. So in this case, the big A can go to your kid, or the little a can go to your kid. And that's one way to preserve genetic variation, right? But again, that's not necessarily always a good thing. In this case, what if this mama bear did pass a little a, and then the papa bear over here, he's not pictured, he's right in the side here, and he gave a little a, and oh, that led to an albino bear. Okay, and now although he's cute, he reminds me of my dog Finnegan, but he's probably not long for this world actually, right? He's going to have a harder time, okay, in nature. But diploidy preserves that mutation, basically, right? And that was a thing when we were talking about genetics. We often said, well, why are these diseases, these autosomal recessive diseases, still here? Because we learned about a bunch of them, and it's probably diploidy, right? We're saving that variation inside of our population because nature, it won't select against you by carrying it, right? The only way it would select against you is if you have both copies or you're homozygous recessive in that case, right? So diploidy is a way to preserve genetic variation. Another one is called balancing selection, okay? And this is when nature basically maintains stable frequencies of two or more phenotypic forms in a population. Okay, so this is a little confusing. Balancing selection includes the heterozygous advantage and frequency-dependent selection. So let's dive into these and see what they mean. Okay, so the heterozygous advantage, this occurs when heterozygotes have a higher fitness than do both homozygotes. All right, and a good way to look at this would certainly be the sickle cell allele, which we've learned about before. So natural selection will tend to maintain two or more alleles at that locus. And in this case, it's because of a disease that's on our planet caused by the Anopheles mosquito, malaria, right? And what's going on here? Why is this this gene, this allele for sickle cell, right? And remember, there's different forms of it, but sometimes it's just one single nucleotide change, which causes a different amino acid, which causes this disease. Why is this staying on planet Earth? Well, because it's called the heterozygous advantage. if you happen to live around this Anopheles mosquito, around the female, she'll bite you, right? And the plasmodium inside of her spit can cause malaria, right? Now, sickle cell is never a good thing. We learned it's pleiotropic, right? It causes terrible things to happen inside of your body, okay? And eventually will likely kill you. However, carrying sickle cell, believe it or not, really helps to make you, not completely, but somewhat immune from malaria. So actually, people who live in Asia, parts of Asia, and in Africa, okay, along this equator, where this female Anopheles mosquito lives, you actually are hoping to be born with one copy, okay, of the sickle cell allele, right? You don't want two copies, because two copies is very dangerous, and you'll likely die of that genetic disorder, okay, or complications of it eventually, right? But if you were born with two normal copies in this case, so let's say that you're listening to this video and you have, normal blood, well, that's good, okay? And your blood's not going to get sickled even when you're hypoxic or low on oxygen. However, if you live around this mosquito, there goes your defense. And now you could die of malaria, right? Whereas if I carry just one copy of sickle cell, which there's very few complications of that, but there are complications if you're a carrier, but barely, right? So if I carry it and I live around this mosquito, I'm in good shape. So that's an example of balancing selection, because we're keeping this other allele around, right? All because of what we call the heterozygous advantage. It might save your life by having that, okay? Another type of balancing selection is called frequency-dependent selection. And here, the fitness of a phenotype declines if it becomes too common in the population, okay? And selection can favor whichever phenotype is less common. So I love these things right here. These are cichlids, and I have my African cichlid tank set up upstairs actually. And some of the lakes aren't even there anymore. Africa used to have these 3 major lakes, but all these beautiful fish that come from there, and they're all different colors. A lot of them are very aggressive, very cool fish. But this is pretty interesting what can happen in different populations. This is from Lake Tanganyika, and if you look here, you have approximately equal numbers of right-mouthed and left-mouthed scale-eating fish. Okay, so here goes a fish swimming by, right? And just think about why this is balancing selection. Okay, here you can see a fish with the mouth on the left side. All right, and he's a scale nipper, right? He's trying to eat some scales off of this guy as he swims. Well, imagine if all of the fish, all of a sudden, right, had the left side of their mouth, or the left side of their head with their mouth on it. Okay, all of a sudden, guess who's going to get pretty smart are the prey, right? The population of fish who get feasted upon. Okay, so basically they would start to look out over this shoulder, all right, to use a poor word there. They would look out in this direction and always be able to tell, or maybe they'd always swim to the right. Okay, so what happens is, you can see here in the graph that, you are also going to keep a lot of right-mouthed fishes around, right? So this population of fish is very stabilized, and this poor guy right here has no idea where it's coming from, right? So another example of balancing selection is frequency-dependent selection. Okay, Beaks, and to wrap up our population genetics discussion, why natural selection cannot fashion perfect organisms, okay? And as you can see, it does come close here. Okay, it comes very close. Perfectionist Boylanicus. Yes. Okay, very, very handsome species there. But what's going on here is selection can only act on existing variations, right? So that's one reason that you're never going to get a perfect organism for your environment. Because if you think about it, you have to use the tools that you're given, right? You can't just tinker something brand new out of thin air, okay? So selection only acts on what you already have. Next up, evolution is limited by historical constraints, right? You don't just make something out of nothing. You can't start from scratch. You're not a brand new organism, right? Like a lump of Play-Doh that we can change into something. No, there's historical constraints for all of us, okay? Imagine if we wanted to fly, for example, right? Well, our bone density is very heavy and thick. So that would be very tough for us to do that because we're limited by historical constraints. Speaking of that, adaptations are often compromises. Sure. So maybe there's something out there that is beneficial in an environment, right? And if this new beneficial trait becomes more common, right, the allelic frequency changes, well, sure, but you know what? That probably came with a cost as well, right? So it's a back and forth, okay, that we always have to deal with through evolution. And then, of course, chance, natural selection, and the environment all interact together. Okay, so we've talked about natural selection, we've talked about genetic drift and gene flow in the last video. And don't forget, all of those are related to the environment in some ways. Now, some of them are just chance and some of them are adaptive in nature. But point is that they all come together, and all three of those working together, there's no goal, right? There's nobody leading that charge to make a perfect organism. It just is what it is, and it's always going to happen. Okay, so that pretty much wraps up population genetics. And I hope you found this video helpful, where we talked a little bit more about natural selection, which is a little bit more than differential reproductive success, right? You dive in a little deeper and you see there's some cool stuff going on there. Okay, so I hope you found this helpful. Take care.